Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. The sun, a merciless copper orb hanging over the Arizona territory, baked the Alkali Flats of the desolate trail leading to the mining settlement of Blackwood Creek. The air was thick and punishing, tasting of fine grit and desperation, a suffocating blanket that pressed down on a scene of raw, unbearable human misery. A ramshackle wagon, its wheels caked with days of punishing mud and now sun-baked to brittle clay, lay overturned beside the rutted track, its meager contents spilled out like the broken pieces of a failed dream. A few dented tin pots, a tattered woolen shawl, and a child's wooden doll staring blankly at the relentless sky. Kneeling in the shadow of the wreckage, her clothes torn and dusted to the color of the trail, was Elara Veridian, a woman whose former beauty was now etched over with lines of exhaustion and terror. Her dark hair, usually pinned neatly, had come undone, strands clinging to the sweat on her face as she shielded two small wide-eyed children, 6-year-old Caleb and 4-year-old Maeve, who whimpered softly, their tiny hands clutching her skirt, their faces pale and streaked with tears and dirt, their small bodies trembling, not just from fear, but from the gnawing hunger that had become their constant companion these last 3 harrowing days since the wagon had broken. The source of Elara's current, agonizing terror wasn't the broken wagon or the starvation. It was the man towering over them, a figure whose presence cast a shadow darker than the wagon itself, a hulking silhouette against the searing desert light. This was Silas Karr, a man whose face was a study in granite hardness and cold, calculating malice, his eyes the dull, predatory color of river stone, set deep beneath a perpetually scowling brow. His lips curled in a perpetual sneer of contemptuous superiority. Silas, the self-appointed overseer of the Blackwood Creek labor camp, was dressed in expensive tailored leather, a jarring contrast to the desperate poverty of the refugees he guarded, and the heavy silver spurs on his boots jingled an ominous, rhythmic threat with every slow, deliberate step he took toward the huddled family, an unnerving sound that sliced through the heavy silence of the desert. He carried a coiled whip, not just for practical use, but as a theatrical flourish of his absolute power, and he tapped it against his calf with a chilling, casual air, enjoying the paralyzing fear he saw in Elara's eyes, relishing the moment of absolute control he held over her fate and the fate of her children. A silent promise of unimaginable cruelty. Elara's voice, when she finally found it, was a raw, choked sound, stripped of all pride and dignity, a desperate plea torn from the deepest well of a mother's instinct to protect her young. She pushed the children further behind her, instinctively trying to make her own body a shield against the man's terrifying presence, her hands trembling as she extended them in a gesture of agonizing, absolute surrender. Her eyes, once vibrant pools of spirit, now swimming with the unbearable, humiliating tears she couldn't hold back. "Take my children," she gasped, the words wrenched from her soul, each syllable a shard of glass in her throat, the sheer desperation of the offer hanging heavy in the hot, stagnant air between them. "Please, Silas. They are weak. They are starving. They will not survive the journey to the camp," she pleaded, her voice cracking under the weight of her impossible choice, the unthinkable sacrifice she was offering, the ultimate severance of the mother-child bond. "Take them back to the town of Shadowbrook. Leave them at the orphanage, the mission, anywhere but here, anywhere they will be safe and fed, away from the cruelty of Blackwood Creek, away from you." Silas merely stopped, his heavy shadow falling across her face, his gaze cold and utterly devoid of mercy, a chilling emptiness that offered no hope of compassion or understanding, his mouth twitching with a cruel, satisfied smile that stretched his thin lips, a silent acknowledgement of her total defeat, the utter shattering of her will. The metallic clang of a horse's hooves, approaching from the south along the dusty, desolate trail, momentarily broke the oppressive tension. A sudden, jarring sound in the stillness that drew Silas's attention, causing his head to snap up in irritation. Elara, blinded by her grief and focused only on the tyrant before her, didn't see the newcomer. But Silas's cruel smile instantly vanished, replaced by a scowl of pure, cold annoyance, a sudden recognition of an unwelcome, external force interrupting his dark drama, his hand dropping from the whip he was coiling. The approaching rider was a classic Western silhouette, a man of quiet, formidable presence, riding a powerful, dusty roan that moved with an effortless, predatory grace that spoke of long, hard miles and unwavering strength, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes, casting his face into an impenetrable shadow that revealed nothing of his intent, nothing of his thoughts. The rider, a man known simply as Creek, a former Texas Ranger turned wandering ranch hand, whose quiet intensity and moral certainty were legendary in these harsh territories, pulled his roan to a stop a careful, measured distance away, the horse's nostrils flaring against the scent of fear and dust, its eyes watching the tableau with the detached intelligence of a battle-tested creature. Creek dismounted with a smooth, unhurried ease that somehow radiated coiled power and immediate danger. His movements economical and precise, the worn leather of his chaps creaking softly, his boots landing silently on the dust-choked ground. His eyes, the startling clear blue of a desert sky at dawn, were fixed not on Silas, but on the huddled family, a gaze that was steady, unreadable, and intensely observant, taking in the scene. The overturned wagon, the desperate woman, the terrified children, the self-satisfied bully. With an almost photographic clarity, weighing the situation, judging the moral geometry of the unfolding drama. He spoke only one sentence, his voice a low, resonant baritone, quiet yet carrying the unmistakable, unwavering authority of a man who rarely had to repeat himself, his words cutting through the tense, heavy silence like a diamond slicing glass. His meaning clear, his judgment final. You're all coming with me. Before the dust settled on Creek's defiant declaration, the narrative pulls back, rewinding 3 years to the bustling yet subtly sinister town of Shadowbrook, a settlement carved out of the unforgiving landscape where opportunity and exploitation danced a dangerous waltz. Here, a younger, more vibrant Elara Veridian had arrived, her heart full of naive hope, clutching the hand of her beloved husband, Thomas Veridian, a man whose gentle eyes and earnest smile masked a fierce ambition, a dream of striking it rich in the burgeoning silver mines of the territory. Thomas, a skilled but often unlucky prospector, had promised Elara a life beyond the quiet poverty they'd known in the East, a future built on the glittering promise of Shadowbrook's legendary lodes. They had bought a small, sturdy cabin on the outskirts of town, its porch overlooking a valley that hinted at wealth, its windows catching the vibrant hues of the setting sun, a picturesque facade for a life that would soon unravel. Elara, then just 22, had thrown herself into making their humble dwelling a home, her hands calloused not by toil, but by the hopeful scrubbing and polishing of their few possessions, her laughter echoing freely through the sparse rooms, a testament to her unshakable optimism and deep love for Thomas. Their first year in Shadowbrook was a period of fragile, hard-won joy, a honeymoon phase where the harsh realities of the Wild West were kept at bay by their shared dreams and unwavering devotion. Thomas, driven by his vision, spent long, arduous days deep in the mines, his pickaxe ringing against rock, his body aching, but his spirit buoyed by Elara's unwavering support. He would return each evening, his face smudged with ore dust, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of discovery, sometimes carrying a small promising sample of quartz that hinted at veins of silver, fueling their shared fantasy of a prosperous future. Elara, in turn, dedicated herself to making their small cabin a sanctuary, preparing simple but nourishing meals, mending his worn clothes, and nurturing the blossoming life within her, the first whisper of Caleb's arrival. The prospect of starting a family in this rugged, wild land filled them with a profound sense of purpose, a shared future stretching out before them, painted in the vibrant colors of hopeful anticipation, an oasis of tender domesticity in the untamed expanse of the frontier. They believed, truly believed, that their love and hard work would carve out a beautiful life, sheltered from the predatory forces that often lurked beneath the surface of such boomtowns. However, the undercurrent of Shadowbrook, a town built on ambition and greed, began to reveal its darker contours. Silas Karr, then a rising figure in the mining operations, a ruthless foreman known for his sharp mind and even sharper temper, began to cast his long shadow over Thomas's endeavors. Silas, older and far more cunning, saw Thomas's honest hard work as both a threat and an opportunity for exploitation, his cold, calculating eyes always watching, always assessing. He'd often advised Thomas, his words laced with veiled threats and false camaraderie, subtly pushing him toward less profitable claims or demanding a larger share of his meager findings, always ensuring that Thomas remained just on the edge of breaking even, never quite tasting true success, always indebted, always struggling. Silas's power in Shadowbrook wasn't just derived from his position, it was built on a network of intimidation and quiet manipulation, a pervasive atmosphere of fear that kept most miners in line, ensuring their endless, unrewarded toil. The town, outwardly vibrant, held a hidden core of desperation, a silent struggle against the iron fist of men like Silas, who profited from the dreams and sweat of others, their fortunes built on the backs of the unsuspecting and the unfortunate. Elara, with her innate sensitivity, started to notice the subtle, disquieting shifts in Thomas, the way his shoulders slumped a little more each evening, the way the light in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a flicker of fear she didn't fully comprehend, a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. He became more withdrawn, less inclined to share his day's struggles, often staring blankly into the flickering fire, lost in a silent battle, his brow furrowed with unspoken anxieties. One evening, after a particularly long silence punctuated only by the crackling of the hearth, Elara gently pressed him, her hand reaching for his, her voice soft but insistent. "Thomas, what troubles you so? Is it the mine? Is it Silas?" Her words hung in the air, revealing her unspoken fears, her growing unease with the changes she observed. Thomas's reaction was immediate and telling, a sharp flinch, a sudden tightening of his jaw, his gaze darting nervously to the window as if unseen eyes were watching, as if the very walls of their humble home could hear, betraying the depth of his unspoken terror. He quickly recovered, forcing a weak smile, dismissing her worries with a wave of his hand. "Nonsense, my love. Just the usual burdens of a man trying to make his fortune. Nothing for you to concern yourself with, not now, not with the baby coming." But his words rang hollow, thin comfort against the growing weight of Elara's intuition. She felt a cold dread begin to coil in her stomach, a premonition of danger, a silent understanding that something far more sinister than mere mining struggles was at play, something that Thomas was desperate to hide from her, to shield her from. She saw the forced cheerfulness in his eyes, the strained smile, and knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her husband was entangled in a web far more dangerous than he let on, a web spun by Silas Karr. The dream of their new life, once so vibrant and promising, now felt fragile, threatened by an unseen enemy, a silent, pervasive dread that whispered of betrayal and hardship. The joy of Caleb's impending arrival was now tinged with a nascent anxiety, a fear for the future, for the safety of her unborn child, for the fate of her gentle, ambitious husband, who seemed to be losing a battle she couldn't yet see, couldn't yet fight alongside him, leaving her with a gnawing sense of helplessness and foreboding. The shadows of Shadowbrook, it seemed, were growing longer and darker, creeping closer to their doorstep, threatening to engulf their fragile happiness, a promise of impending doom that she sensed but couldn't yet fully grasp. The truth, when it finally surfaced 6 months after Caleb's birth, was a brutal, crushing weight that shattered the fragile peace Elara had desperately maintained. Thomas, driven by a blend of reckless optimism and intense pressure from Silas Karr, had risked everything on a single, highly promising silver lode known as the Serafina vein, a claim rumored to contain enough ore to set them up for life. To secure the necessary blasting powder, heavy equipment, and laborers, a crew Silas had insisted on providing, Thomas had signed a catastrophic loan agreement, a predatory contract expertly crafted by Silas's associates, securing the debt not with a lien on the mine, which was standard practice, but with a claim on their property and, most chillingly, an unspecified future commitment of labor. A chilling term Silas had inserted under the guise of good faith collateral. Thomas, desperate and blinded by the silver-laden vision of instant wealth and the pressure of providing for his new family, had signed the papers without fully grasping the cold, legalistic traps laid out for him, a moment of tragic hubris that would define the rest of their lives, a gamble he knew he was losing even before the ink was dry. The subsequent months were a blur of frenzied, increasingly desperate labor, marked by the constant chilling presence of Silas Karr, who had become a daily fixture at the Serafina vein, his expensive boots crunching on the dusty claim, his eyes sharp and critical, his voice dripping with condescending judgment, subtly undermining Thomas's authority and confidence. Silas didn't just supervise, he meticulously sabotaged, intentionally providing Thomas with substandard tools, unreliable laborers who slowed progress, and confusing, often contradictory geological advice that led Thomas to drill and blast in the wrong locations, systematically draining the financial resources Thomas had borrowed. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Elara watched her husband transform before her eyes, the gentle light extinguished, replaced by a hollow-eyed exhaustion, a silent, pervasive fear that gnawed at his core, making him jumpy and irritable, retreating further into his own troubled mind. She would sometimes wake in the middle of the night to find him sitting on the edge of the bed, staring into the dark, his breath ragged, the physical manifestation of his internal terror palpable in the small, silent room. One raw, wind-swept evening, a day after Thomas had received a final, menacing written demand from Silas's legal man, a document that detailed the full extent of the usurious interest and the imminent forfeiture clauses, he finally broke, the pressure too immense to bear alone any longer. He found Elara by the cradle, gently rocking the sleeping Caleb, her face illuminated by the soft, warm glow of a tallow candle, a picture of domestic serenity that only amplified his own feelings of failure and shame. Thomas sank onto a nearby chair, his large, rough hands shaking visibly as he ran them through his already disheveled hair, his usual quiet strength dissolving into a raw, broken vulnerability. He confessed everything, the shame making his voice hoarse, each word a painful admission of his disastrous mistake, the true scale of the debt, the predatory contract, the chilling inclusion of the labor commitment, and his growing, terrifying certainty that the Serafina vein was a bust, that the silver was not there, only endless, empty rock. Elara listened, her face draining of color, the soft candlelight casting sharp, unforgiving shadows on her features, her maternal instinct immediately overriding her shock and hurt, her mind racing, already analyzing, planning, searching for a path to survival. The betrayal wasn't from Thomas. She saw his desperation, his fatal mistake, but from Silas, whose calculated cruelty now appeared monstrous, designed not just to take their claim, but to utterly break them. She rose slowly, her movements deliberate, her eyes meeting Thomas's with a fierce, unwavering determination he hadn't seen before, an internal fire igniting within her. She gently placed her hand on his trembling shoulder, her touch firm and comforting, a quiet strength flowing from her to him, a promise of shared resilience. "We will face this together, Thomas. Tell me everything Silas took, everything he wants," she commanded, her voice low and steady, the voice of a woman who had just realized she was at war, her previous anxieties hardening into a resolve of cold steel. The climax of their hardship arrived with brutal swiftness too, weeks later. Silas, using the manufactured default on the predatory loan agreement, arrived with two grim-faced deputies, their badges tarnished symbols of the corrupted authority that governed Shadowbrook, accompanied by the town's cold, meticulous justice of the peace. They presented the papers. The Serafina vein was legally foreclosed upon, the debt called due, and, most damningly, the cabin and all their meager assets were seized, leaving them with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The final, horrifying blow was the activation of the labor commitment clause. Thomas, along with countless other desperate men Silas had ensnared over the years, was now legally bound to a life of grueling, indentured servitude in Silas's newly acquired and notoriously brutal Blackwood Creek labor camp, a desolate prison masquerading as a mine. Elara watched, numb with shock and rage, as Thomas was led away, his face a mask of utter defeat and silent apology, his last agonizing look a silent plea for forgiveness and protection for their son, a promise of his eventual return that echoed hollowly in the now empty shell of their home. The moment Thomas was forcibly taken, disappearing into the dust cloud raised by Silas Karr's carriage, a seismic shift occurred within Elara, transforming the grieving wife into a fierce, calculating protector. The initial shock and paralyzing grief quickly calcified into a cold, focused resolve. She knew crying or pleading with the system that Silas corrupted would only consume her. Her immediate singular purpose became survival and, eventually, reunification. With Caleb strapped tight against her chest in the shawl and only a small, worn leather pouch containing the last few silver coins she had secretly hoarded, coins meant for a future sewing machine, she was forcibly ejected from their home. She stood on the roadside, watching the deputies nail the foreclosure notice onto the door, the wood of her former sanctuary suddenly looking foreign and hostile, and she swore an oath under the vast, indifferent blue sky that she would not let Silas Karr destroy the rest of her family. She had to stay close to Thomas, close enough to the Blackwood Creek labor camp to attempt a rescue, but far enough away to ensure the safety of her son, a precarious, desperate balancing act. Elara found refuge in the extreme outskirts of Shadowbrook, in a dilapidated, abandoned shack near the old watermill, a place so remote and forgotten that Silas's watchful eyes wouldn't bother to search. Survival became a relentless daily grind of sheer will. She took on the most grueling, poorly paid tasks available to a solitary woman, mending torn canvas for the freight haulers, washing the bloodied bandages from the town's small, overwhelmed clinic, and cleaning the vile saloon spittoons after the drunken, raucous crowds had gone, hiding her face beneath a heavy bonnet and working silently, ceaselessly, hoarding every penny, never allowing herself the luxury of exhaustion or despair. She subsisted on thin gruel and stale bread, giving the precious small portions of goat's milk and any meager protein she could scavenge entirely to Caleb, watching over his small, sleeping form with a ferocious intensity that betrayed her internal turmoil, determined that her child would not suffer the physical tolls of her desperation. She was no longer just a woman, she was a logistical machine, driven by an almost manic focus on the next meal, the next day, the next step towards freedom. 2 years crawled by, marked by the slow, painful growth of Caleb and the quiet accumulation of a meager escape fund. Her heart grew heavier with each passing month, weighted by the constant grinding fear that she would never see Thomas again, that the Blackwood Creek camp, rumored to be a place of starvation, disease, and lethal accidents, had already claimed him. Then, a new life stirred within her, a quiet, unexpected miracle in the midst of her protracted misery. She was pregnant with Maeve. This discovery, initially a source of paralyzing fear, quickly solidified her resolve. She saw it not as a burden, but as a sign, a reason to fight harder, a reason to leave the oppressive shadows of Shadowbrook immediately. She knew that bringing a baby into the world in that wretched shack, under Silas's potential reach, was an unsinkable risk. The need to move, to attempt the journey to the camp where Thomas was held, became an urgent existential imperative, fueled by the primal instinct to protect her unborn child and secure their entire future. She spent her final weeks in Shadowbrook secretly purchasing a worn-out, rickety wagon from an elderly, sympathetic prospector who asked no questions and charged a mercifully low price, paying with the small, precious hoard of silver coins she had saved. She loaded the wagon with the few essentials she had managed to acquire: a small bag of dried beans, 2 gallons of stored water, a threadbare blanket, and a few pieces of mended clothing. The journey to Blackwood Creek was notoriously difficult, a 200-mile trek across the high desert and unforgiving Alkali Flats. But Elara had meticulously memorized the rough, hand-drawn map Thomas had once sketched for her, detailing the treacherous shortcuts and hidden water sources only known to experienced miners, a map she had painstakingly committed to memory before destroying it. With a final, silent nod of defiance towards the distant glittering mines of Shadowbrook, she set out, the heavily pregnant woman and her toddler son, facing the barren, menacing expanse of the desert, heading toward the rumored hell of the labor camp, her hope a tiny, flickering flame in the vast darkness. The journey was a living nightmare of physical endurance and emotional devastation. The rickety wagon was constantly breaking down, the horse was perpetually exhausted, and the relentless desert heat sapped their strength and drained their precious water reserves faster than she anticipated. Maeve was born 2 months into the journey, delivered alone by Elara in the desperate, silent darkness, beneath a thin canopy of stars, a testament to her fierce, solitary strength. The subsequent weeks saw the little family reduced to a state of near starvation, rationing water down to mere sips, Elara's own body giving way to exhaustion and hunger, the fear of death a cold, constant companion. It was on the 3rd day after the final catastrophic wheel breakage, the wagon overturned and the children weak with hunger and dehydration, that they were found. Silas Karr, leading a small patrol of guards returning from a supply run to Shadowbrook, encountered them exactly where Elara's strength had finally given out, the sight of the tyrant's face confirming her worst fears and forcing her ultimate heart-wrenching plea: to save her children, even if it meant giving them up forever, a desperate sacrifice of a mother's heart. The air thickened, crackling not just with the desert heat, but with the silent, coiled tension that sprung up instantly between the two men. Silas Karr's reaction to Creek's arrival was one of pure, unadulterated fury and shock, the sudden interruption of his sadistic drama throwing him completely off balance. His self-satisfied sneer curdled into a mask of aggressive, entitled rage, his hand instinctively dropping to the heavy silver-plated pistol holstered at his hip, his fingers twitching near the grip, a clear, unmistakable escalation of the danger. Silas knew Creek's reputation, a man of few words, formidable skill, and a moral code that was inconveniently strict, and he recognized the immediate severe threat the cowboy represented to his absolute authority in this desolate, lawless stretch of land. Silas's 2 accompanying guards, younger men with the vacant, cruel eyes of hide muscle, reacted to their boss's tension, nervously shifting their rifles and fanning out slightly, creating a menacing semicircle around Elara and the children, their faces betraying a mixture of habitual obedience and a sudden, unsettling uncertainty about the silent man on the roan. Creek, however, remained a study in quiet, almost unsettling stillness, his posture on the roan's back radiating an unnerving calm that suggested he had all the time in the world, an unnervingly patient predator. He hadn't yet drawn his weapon, his hands resting lightly on the pommel of his saddle, but his entire being, the set of his jaw, the unwavering intensity of his blue eyes beneath the hat brim, communicated a silent, unyielding preparedness that was far more intimidating than Silas's theatrical posturing. His voice, when he spoke again, was deliberately slow and even, cutting through the heavy silence with the measured weight of a final, irrevocable decision, addressing not Silas, but the desolate landscape around them, cementing the fact that he was the only authority that mattered in this moment. "Karr," Creek said, using the name with a quiet contempt that stripped the foreman of any perceived power. "I know where you're taking these people. I know what that camp is. Leave the woman and the children with me. You can ride back to your operation and tell them the desert claimed them, just like you tell them about every other soul that disappears out here. I'm offering you a clean way out of a messy situation, a chance to avoid the consequences of crossing me." Silas, his face contorted with outrage, could not fathom being defied, especially not in front of his guards and a broken woman who had just offered her children to him. The insult of Creek's quiet confidence was too much for his enormous ego to bear, sparking a blind tactical error. "You arrogant fool!" Silas roared, his voice thick with menace, raising his whip and cracking it against the air with a savage, ear-splitting crack that made the children whimper again and the roan shift nervously. "This woman and her entire wretched family belong to me. Her husband signed a contract and she has violated the terms of her travel. They are chattel. I decide their fate, not some wandering piece of low country trash. Get on your horse and ride, or I'll have my men fill you and your damn beast full of lead, and then I'll take the mother and the brats to the camp anyway, where they will earn back the debt 10 times over, working the tailings until their hands bleed." This brutal, callous pronouncement, the reduction of Elara and her children to mere chattel, was the precise line that Creek was waiting for, the final, unforgivable confirmation of Silas's evil. In an instantaneous blur of motion that defied the eye, a movement born of years of combat and lightning-fast reflexes, Creek's right hand moved. The action was swift and deadly. His custom-made, well-oiled Colt Peacemaker cleared leather and barked once, a shockingly loud report that shattered the desert stillness, before Silas Karr had even managed to fully draw his own weapon. The bullet was aimed not at Silas, but with cold, deliberate precision, at the expensive silver spurs on the foreman's boot, the impact sending a shower of pulverized earth and metal fragments into the air, spinning Silas violently off balance and sending him sprawling into the dust, howling not from physical pain, but from the sudden, profound shock of the humiliating assault on his vanity and control. As Silas lay stunned, winded, and disarmed on the ground, his face suddenly white with fear, the two guards, momentarily paralyzed by the speed and audacity of Creek's action, slowly began to raise their rifles. Creek, however, had already shifted his aim. The revolver now pointed directly at the lead guard's chest, his voice dropping to a dangerous icy whisper that somehow carried further than Silas's frantic shouts, a sound that promised immediate death. "The contract is void. This debt is settled. You raise that rifle, and you'll spend eternity trying to reload it." The sheer, terrifying conviction in his voice, the evidence of his deadly speed lying right there in the dust next to their writhing boss, was enough. The lead guard slowly, reluctantly lowered his rifle, the sound of the metallic clink against the dry earth, sounding like a hammer blow of surrender, his younger accomplice instantly following suit, all pretense of authority dissolving into a pathetic display of self-preservation. Creek, still mounted, looked down at the utterly defeated Silas, then at Elara, whose face was a study in pure, disbelieving awe, and repeated his promise, his eyes locking onto hers with an unwavering, fierce sincerity. "You're all coming with me." Creek's rescue wasn't an offer, it was an extraction. After disarming the two stunned guards and contemptuously kicking Silas Karr's pistol into the dust where it was swallowed by the thirsty sand, Creek secured Elara and her children with quiet, efficient speed. He didn't waste time on explanations or reassurances, understanding that action spoke louder than words to a woman who had endured years of betrayal and despair. He quickly inspected the overturned wagon, deemed it irreparable and too great a liability for their necessary speed, and ruthlessly abandoned it, understanding that possessions were meaningless next to life. He helped Elara, who moved with the jerky, hesitant motions of someone in shock, to gather her small children, gently lifting the frail Maeve and placing her in Elara's arms, then hoisting the small, terrified Caleb onto the back of the roan, positioning him securely in front of the saddle, wrapping a portion of his own heavy duster around the child for warmth and security. He then instructed Elara, his voice a low, steady rumble, to grasp his belt tightly for the long, arduous journey ahead, indicating she would ride behind him, sandwiched between the protection of his back and the child. With a final, contemptuous glance back at Silas Karr, who was now scrambling to his feet, sputtering threats and oaths of vengeance that evaporated uselessly in the vast, indifferent air, Creek mounted his horse and, without a single backward look, rode away from the Alkali Flats, leaving the defeated foreman and his shaken guards marooned in the middle of nowhere, a humiliating monument to Silas's lost control. The immediate danger was past, but the subsequent hours of riding were agonizingly silent and grueling, forcing Elara to confront the full, dizzying reality of her sudden reprieve. The sun beat down mercilessly, transforming the long ride into a physical ordeal, her muscles screaming in protest from the unnatural strain of the saddle, the constant jolting motion a painful reminder of her physical frailty. Yet, the pain was strangely dulled by the overwhelming relief of escape, the profound, visceral understanding that her children were safe, no longer under the shadow of Silas's cruel intentions. She rode with her cheek pressed against the rough, reassuring leather of Creek's vest, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the steady, powerful thrum of his own, finding an unexpected, total safety in the quiet strength of the stranger who had materialized out of the desert dust. Creek maintained a relentless, punishing pace, his entire focus on putting as much distance as possible between them and Silas's inevitable pursuit, demonstrating an intimate, almost intuitive knowledge of the desolate terrain. He didn't speak, not even a syllable, but his movements communicated a steady, reassuring competence that began to soothe Elara's terror. When they paused briefly at a hidden spring, a trickling source he seemed to know instinctively, he worked with the same silent, purposeful efficiency. He gave the first larger sips of the precious, cool water to the children, carefully monitoring their small, thirsty movements, ensuring they drank slowly, then offered Elara the remaining water, only drinking himself after they were satisfied, a silent demonstration of prioritizing their needs over his own that spoke volumes about his character and moral compass. He produced a small, dried piece of jerky from his saddlebag, cutting it into tiny, manageable pieces for Caleb and Maeve, watching their weak, desperate chewing with a remote, yet deeply protective air, then simply and without fanfare, offered the rest to Elara, an act of shared sustenance that felt more profound than any spoken promise. As the searing sun began its slow, inevitable descent, painting the western sky in dramatic, intense strokes of crimson and gold, Creek finally broke the long, heavy silence, his voice low and devoid of emotion, a tone that offered facts, not sentiment. "We ride for the ranch of Judge Elias Vance," he stated, his voice a gravelly murmur that was barely audible over the weary rhythm of the roan's hooves. "He's a retired circuit judge, settled near the Pecos, a good man with a sharp mind, and he won't be swayed by Silas's corrupted law. He's the only man I trust to sort out this mess, to look at the paperwork and make a judgment that actually means something." He paused, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon, then added a crucial, chilling detail, his voice hardening slightly. "Silas will send riders after us. He won't let this go. He won't stop until he sees you all back in his camp, or buried in the desert. We ride hard all night. Don't sleep, Elara. Not until I tell you." Elara listened to his quiet, chilling assessment, the truth of his words snapping her out of her stunned passivity, replacing the days of shock with a renewed, fierce urgency. She knew the threat was real. Silas's pride and power had been mortally wounded, and his vengeance would be relentless and unforgiving, fueled by the humiliation of his public defeat. For the first time, she truly looked at the man who had risked his life for her family. Creek was a man carved from the rugged country he rode through, his face perpetually shadowed by the wide brim of his hat, the lines around his eyes etched deep from years of watching the distant horizon. He was not a hero of polished words, but one of silent, decisive action, a man whose presence was a guarantee of safety. As the last sliver of the sun disappeared, plunging the desert into the vast, star-pricked darkness of the Wild West night. Elara closed her eyes, not in despair, but in a profound, quiet moment of thanksgiving, clinging to the realization that her life, and the lives of her children, now rested entirely in the competent, silent hands of this mysterious, unwavering cowboy, riding into the unknown towards the promised sanctuary of Judge Vance's remote ranch. They arrived at the Vance Ranch just as the pale, cool light of dawn was stretching across the rugged plains, illuminating a sprawling, well-kept homestead that looked like a fortress of civilization against the vast wilderness. The sight of the solid stone house, the neat fences, and the bustling corrals, a stark contrast to the desolate trail they had just escaped, brought a wave of emotional relief that nearly buckled Elara's knees. The exhaustion of the night finally catching up to her, a bone-deep weariness that only the sight of safety could allow. Creek, showing no visible sign of fatigue despite the brutal, continuous ride, dismounted with his characteristic unhurried grace and immediately helped Elara, whose limbs were stiff and aching, easing her down to the ground, his touch surprisingly gentle beneath the rough texture of his working clothes. He then carefully lifted the sleeping children, carrying the 2 small bundles as easily as sacks of feed, his protectiveness unwavering. He entrusted Elara and the children to the care of Mrs. Vance, the judge's wife, a kind-faced, matronly woman whose immediate, compassionate response, warm blankets, fresh water, and the promise of a hot meal, was the first true kindness Elara had experienced in years, triggering a release of emotion she couldn't suppress. Judge Elias Vance, a towering man with a shock of silver hair and eyes that held the wisdom and fatigue of decades spent dispensing justice across a brutal territory, met Creek in his large, book-lined study. The room was a sanctuary of civilization, smelling of leather, old paper, and pipe tobacco, its massive desk serving as the stage for countless dramas of frontier law. Creek recounted the entire story with his usual economy of language, his report precise and devoid of emotional embellishment. The predatory loan, the labor contract, Thomas's captivity, Elara's desperate flight, Silas Karr's ambush, and the final violent confrontation at Alkali Flats. Judge Vance listened in utter silence, his expression grim and contemplative, occasionally stroking his heavy, silver-tipped cane. The only sound in the quiet room, the soft tap-tap of the cane. Against the wooden floor, a rhythmic beat that underscored the gravity of the events being recounted. When Creek finished, the judge rose slowly, walked to the heavy mahogany sideboard, and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid, offering one to Creek, a silent acknowledgement of the seriousness of the shared burden. Silas Karr, the judge finally murmured, the name heavy with years of unspoken contempt, is a cancer on this territory, a blight on the good name of the mines. We have been waiting for the opportunity to cut him out, but his paperwork is always meticulously clean. His methods predatory, yes, but often just inside the bounds of the letter of the law. He understands that greed is the only law many men respect. He paused, turning to face Creek, his eyes narrowing with a look of sharp, legalistic calculation. You say Thomas Veridian signed a contract containing an unspecified labor commitment, and that his wife's flight was used as a violation of the terms of a debt? This is the crux of the matter. If we can prove the initial contract was usurious and predatory, designed to enslave, and not a legitimate business agreement, we can invalidate his entire claim over the family. The children are clearly too young for such terms to apply, but Thomas and Elara, Silas will argue they are his property until the debt is paid. Creek responded instantly, his eyes focused on the legal strategy with the clarity of a man plotting a battle. He intends to pursue them, Judge. His humiliation was absolute. He will use every crooked deputy and bounty hunter he can buy. The law won't stop him. Only a final, clear judgment will. He then gestured towards the door, indicating where Elara was resting. The woman is strong, but she is utterly broken by years of fear and guilt over her husband's fate. We need to tell her the truth about the contract, but also give her a weapon, a chance to fight back, to reclaim her dignity, and to free Thomas. The conversation shifted, delving into the cold, intricate mechanics of frontier law, countersuits, restraining orders that were often useless against a brute like Silas, and the absolute necessity of obtaining the original signed contract to analyze the specific predatory language that had enslaved Thomas and was now threatening Elara. Later that afternoon, after she had slept deeply for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, bathed, and eaten a proper, nourishing meal, Elara was summoned to the study. She stood before the powerful Judge Vance and the silent, watchful Creek, her fear replaced by a nervous determination. Judge Vance, speaking with measured gravity, laid out the full, devastating legal reality of Thomas's predicament, explaining in simple, unflinching terms how Silas had used the law to mask his cruelty. He explained that her own selfless offer, "Take my children," had unwittingly provided Silas with a legal pretext to claim they had abandoned their debt obligation, making their status even more precarious. But then, his voice softened, offering a strategic olive branch, a crucial twist. "Mrs. Veridian," the judge said, his voice firm, "Silas Karr's strength is his paperwork. His weakness is his greed. He wouldn't have foreclosed on your cabin unless he knew the Serafina vein held something truly valuable. I believe your husband found the silver, and Silas stole the claim before he could announce it. The true solution to freeing Thomas lies not in proving the lone predatory, but in proving Silas committed fraud, that he stole a fully paid, valuable asset. The realization, the possibility of her husband's success and subsequent betrayal, hit Elara like a physical blow, igniting a devastating, blinding flash of painful clarity and a new, terrible motivation. Not just to save Thomas, but to see Silas pay for the grand, final theft of their dream. The realization that Thomas might have been successful, that Silas had not merely enslaved him over debt but over stolen wealth, transformed Elara's pain into a focused, chilling fury, granting her a clarity and strength she didn't know she possessed. The judge's theory, based on years of observing Silas's patterns, was a powerful truth. Silas Karr wouldn't waste his time seizing an empty claim. The Serafina vein had produced, and Silas had orchestrated the default to steal the silver and Thomas's labor in one fell swoop. This revelation became the burning core of Elara's purpose. With this understanding, her mission shifted from a desperate rescue to a calculated act of justice. The key to proving the fraud and collapsing Silas's legal empire lay with the original contract and Thomas's mining log, the evidence of the silver strike, all of which Silas would be keeping in his personal safe or office, the final trophies of his deceit. The strategy was simple, audacious, and terrifying. Elara would be the one to retrieve the documents. Creek, the tactical mind of the operation, explained his logic with a detached practicality that betrayed the danger. Silas has eyes watching the judge, watching me. If I approach Shadowbrook, he'll know it's a trap, and he'll move the evidence. You, Elara, are a ghost in this town. He thinks you're broken, starving, or already in the Blackwood camp. You are the last person he would expect to walk through his front door. The judge vehemently disagreed with the idea of sending her back into such peril, his face etched with concern. But Elara's acceptance was instant and unwavering, her eyes meeting Creek's with a steely resolve that mirrored his own quiet intensity. She understood the inherent power of being underestimated. The next day was spent in meticulous, intensive preparation at the ranch. Elara studied the judge's detailed, hand-drawn map of Silas's Shadowbrook office, learning the placement of the safe, the patrol routes, and the weak points of the building's security, absorbing the information with a grim, focused efficiency. The following night, under the cold, watchful glare of a sliver moon, Elara, dressed in borrowed dark clothing that allowed her to merge into the shadows, rode out with Creek, leaving the children in the safe custody of Mrs. Vance, a separation that was emotionally brutal, but necessary for their eventual salvation. They rode hard until they were within a day's ride of Shadowbrook. Creek then stopped, his hand resting on the bridle of her borrowed swift quarter horse, his eyes holding a rare flicker of something close to concern. "Elara," he said, his voice low and serious, "I'll leave you outside of town. You have one day. The moment you secure the contract and the log, meet me at the Three Sisters Butte, an old, weathered landmark 10 miles due east of Shadowbrook, at midnight. If you are not there by 1 a.m., I am coming in. Don't hesitate. Get the papers and get out." He handed her a small, elegant Derringer pistol, explaining its single deadly purpose. The cold metal feeling heavy and alien in her palm, a symbol of the desperate and dangerous role she was now forced to play. Elara slipped into Shadowbrook at dawn, a silent, invisible shadow, the familiar streets stirring painful memories of a life that was stolen. She spent the day watching Silas Karr's office, a squat stone building attached to the town's bank, a physical manifestation of his corrupt influence. She noted the guards' shift changes, their habitual laziness, and the precise moment Silas left for his evening meeting with the mine owners. That night, she moved. The fear was a cold, constant companion, a tremor beneath her skin, but it was overridden by the burning image of Thomas's face and the promise of Maeve and Caleb's freedom. She used a small, brass skeleton key, a carefully chosen tool provided by the judge, to slip into the back entrance of the bank and then into Silas's private office. The air inside was thick with the faint smell of expensive cigars and the heavy scent of unearned wealth, a disgusting reminder of the man who had ruined her life. She found the safe hidden behind a large framed portrait of Silas himself, a sickening display of vanity. Following the judge's specific instructions, she used a listening cone and worked the complex combination, her breath held tight in her chest, the soft rhythmic click of the tumblers sounding deafeningly loud in the silent office. A terrifying, time-consuming process. Finally, with a soft, heavy thunk, the safe door gave way. Inside, nestled beneath ledgers and cash, were two documents: the rolled, yellowed original contract and, next to it, Thomas's small leather-bound mining log filled with his neat handwriting, dates and sketches, the definitive record of his discovery and Silas's ultimate betrayal. Elara snatched them up, securing them in a pouch tied tightly around her waist. Just as she turned to leave, the door to the outer office creaked open. Silas Karr had returned unexpectedly early, his heavy, recognizable footsteps crossing the floor, his voice booming a sudden, guttural command. "Who's in here?" Elara froze, her entire being turning to ice, the two stolen documents heavy against her abdomen, a cruel irony of freedom hanging in the balance. The sound of Silas Karr's voice, thick with irritation and the unmistakable hint of danger, was closer than she had anticipated, echoing off the stone walls of the office with menacing clarity. She scrambled, moving with the silent, desperate speed of an animal fleeing a predator, diving behind the thick velvet drapery that covered the large office window, holding her breath, forcing herself to be utterly still, a rigid statue of sheer terror. The single small Derringer pistol felt like a fragile, inadequate defense against the bulk and brutality of the foreman, a final resort she desperately hoped not to use. Silas Karr stomped into the inner office, his massive shadow preceding him, his eyes scanning the room with the practiced suspicion of a man accustomed to treachery. He saw the open safe, its heavy door a shocking, visible sign of intrusion, and his usual cold rage exploded into a blinding, murderous fury. He roared, a sound of profound loss and betrayal, his hands slamming down on the desk, scattering papers like an autumn gale. He knew instantly what was missing, not the cash, which remained untouched, but the specific, damning legal documents he had meticulously guarded, the proof of his systemic fraud. As he frantically checked the safe again, his back momentarily turned to her. Elara, seizing the fractional opportunity, realized she couldn't wait. She moved, not towards the door, but towards the nearest window, knowing the front entrance was a death trap. She silently pushed aside the heavy drapes, her heart hammering against her ribs with painful, frantic urgency. revealing herself just as Silas spun around, his hand already reaching for the heavy pistol holstered on his hip, his eyes finally locking onto her figure. The recognition was a slow, dawning horror on Silas's face, a mixture of disbelief, outrage, and dawning comprehension. "The woman!" he spat, the words heavy with disbelief, his mind struggling to reconcile the broken, desperate refugee he had left to die with the determined figure standing before him. You actually thought you could crawl back here and steal from me." He drew his pistol, the cold steel gleaming menacingly in the dim lamplight filtering from the outer office, aiming the muzzle with a terrifying, professional calm, his finger tightening on the trigger, prepared to silence her instantly, to eliminate the living proof of his vulnerability. "You should have let me take the brats, Elara. Now you'll lose everything." In that split-second, heart-stopping moment, Elara did not plead. She acted. The years of oppression, the crushing shame, the desperate, solitary struggle for her children's survival, all coalesced into a blinding white heat of self-preservation and righteous vengeance. She didn't hesitate. She didn't aim. She simply raised the tiny derringer and, guided by pure primal instinct, fired at the massive silhouette before her. The shot was deafeningly loud in the confined space, a sharp, concussive crack, followed by the immediate sickening sound of Silas's own pistol clattering to the floor. Elara hadn't killed him, but her shot, aimed low and true, found its mark, slamming into his leg, a debilitating, painful hit that caused him to stagger back, howling with sudden, blinding agony, his hands clutching the wound, his concentration completely shattered. Ignoring the throbbing pain of the fall and the lingering sound of Silas's enraged, agonized bellowing, Elara smashed the heavy glass of the window with the butt of the empty derringer. The shattering glass, a deafening symphony of her escape. She scrambled through the broken pane, cutting her hands on the jagged shards, the pain a distant secondary concern to the all-consuming need for flight. She landed hard on the dusty ground outside, regaining her footing instantly, and ran, sprinting through the dark, deserted alleyways towards the outskirts of the town. Not looking back, her focus absolute. The Three Sisters Butte, where Creek waited. Silas's enraged, fragmented shouts, "Stop her! She's got the papers! After her!" echoed behind her, accompanied by the chaotic sounds of his guards being roused, the sudden urgency and clatter of horses being saddled, the chase already beginning, the entire town being pulled into the climax of the desperate drama she had ignited. Elara ran until her lungs burned with the effort, the fear driving her past the point of exhaustion, her legs pumping with superhuman effort. She reached her waiting horse, its reins tied to a lonely hitching post outside of town, and vaulted onto the saddle with an adrenaline-fueled athleticism she hadn't known she possessed, clutching the pouch with the documents like a life raft. She turned the horse towards the east, towards the dark, distant promise of the Three Sisters Butte, the galloping rhythm of the horse's hooves drowning out the sounds of the approaching pursuit. She rode not as the desperate, pleading woman, but as a fierce, determined warrior, finally in possession of the only weapon that mattered, the truth. Elara reached the base of the Three Sisters Butte, exactly at the stroke of midnight, her horse staggering from exhaustion, its coat lathered with foam. The iconic, tripartite rock formation was silhouetted against the dark sky, a landmark of freedom. Creek was there, exactly where he promised, a quiet, reassuring presence in the darkness, standing beside his powerful roan, his rifle cradled casually in his arms, his posture radiating a readiness that was both comforting and terrifying. He assessed Elara in one swift, silent glance. The frantic exhaustion, the bloodied hands, the wild, triumphant fear in her eyes, and the bulging pouch clutched at her waist. Without a word, he took her reins and led the horse aside, then looked past her, into the vast, dark expanse from which she had just emerged. "They're coming," Elara gasped, struggling to catch her breath, forcing the words out through raw, parched lungs. Silas was there. "He's hurt. He sent everyone." Creek simply nodded, his face grim, acknowledging the predictable pursuit. Then, in the same continuous motion, he reached out, and Elara instantly handed him the leather pouch containing the original contract and the mining log. This transfer of the evidence, this small silent exchange, was the final critical step, the passing of the torch from the desperate fighter to the unwavering defender. Creek immediately placed the documents inside his own jacket, securing them against his chest, the weight of the evidence now resting with him. "We ride now, Elara. Fast. The judge is waiting, and we have enough law on our side to hold them off." The subsequent ride was a furious, desperate dash back towards the safety of the Vance Ranch. Creek chose a different, more treacherous path, utilizing canyons and rough terrain, known only to a few, a calculated maneuver to lose the pursuing riders. Just as dawn was breaking, the sound of galloping horses behind them confirmed Silas's men had not given up the chase. They reached the outer perimeter of the Vance Ranch to find Judge Vance and several trusted ranch hands, armed and ready, forming a formidable, static line of defense, a physical barricade of law and order. Creek, Elara, and her horse burst through the gate just as Silas Karr's riders, led by a desperate, shouting guard, appeared over the final ridge, pulling up short as they saw the armed reception line and the imposing figure of Judge Vance standing in the morning light. Judge Vance stepped forward, holding a rifle, his voice booming across the distance, carrying the full, unchallengeable authority of the law. "You trespass on private property under my jurisdiction, and you pursue a woman who is under my protection and who has filed charges of fraud against your employer, Silas Karr. Turn back now or face arrest for armed invasion." The guard hesitated, glancing back toward the trail, searching for his wounded leader, seeing only the unwavering determination in the faces of the armed ranch hands. The weight of the judge's authority, backed by Creek's menacing silence, was too much. The guards slowly, reluctantly turned their horses and retreated, vanishing back into the dust, their defeat final and absolute. Within the week, using the irrefutable evidence provided by the original contract, which clearly showed usurious terms and an illegal commitment clause, and Thomas's mining log, which proved a significant silver strike occurred before the contract was called into default, Judge Vance initiated the legal process that led to the full invalidation of the Veridian debt and the issuance of an immediate warrant for Silas Karr's arrest on charges of grand fraud and illegal enslavement. Silas, crippled and exposed, was eventually cornered and taken into custody near Shadowbrook, his empire collapsing under the weight of his own meticulously crafted but ultimately flawed paperwork. The final, heartbreaking yet utterly triumphant scene took place 1 month later, when a thin, pale but recognizable Thomas Veridian stepped off the stagecoach in front of the Vance Ranch. A freed man, his indenture papers voided, and returned to him, a new life waiting. He stumbled forward, seeing his wife, Elara, standing with their 2 healthy, vibrant children, Caleb and Maeve, by her side. Elara ran to him, throwing her arms around him, holding him with a fierce, possessive love that communicated the entire, agonizing journey they had both endured, the words unspoken, yet understood. Thomas held his children, his face wet with tears of relief and love, his gaze eventually finding Creek, who stood quietly to the side, his characteristic blue eyes watching the reunion with a rare, quiet hint of satisfaction. Thomas managed only a raw, choked whisper of thanks. Creek, ever the man of few words, simply nodded once. The Veridian family, broken and scattered by greed, was finally whole again, their freedom bought with courage, sacrifice, and the unwavering intervention of a quiet cowboy whose moral code was the truest law of the land. They stayed at the Vance Ranch, working for the judge, planning their future, their story becoming a legend whispered on the wind, a testament to the fierce, enduring love of a mother and the quiet, uncompromising justice of a man who simply said, "You're all coming with me."